Welcome to this presentation on collective nouns. Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be talking about collective nouns, and there's two common issues with connected nouns, but they're both closely related. Usually if you resolve one of the issues, the other issue solves itself. So there's kind of a central problem with it that expresses itself in two different ways. If you don't already have your Aspen Handbook handy, please go ahead and pause me and get it ready. If you are using the green third edition, we'll be working on pages 18 and 19 as well as page 8 and 9. If you have the red or fourth edition of the of the Aspen Handbook, we'll be working on page, let's see, I guess this is page 8. And page 9 and 10, and then we'll probably be on about 17 or 18. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with the substance. I have my continuing Word document, which you'll be able to see posted within your course to give you a little bit of explanation. But let's first of all talk about what a collective noun is. And here we have a definition in the fourth edition. Collective nouns, first of all, are nouns. I guess there's no surprise there. It makes sense that they would be nouns, and that's what's part of their name. And then we know that they stand for a group of something. And so when we have a committee, that's a group of human beings. A corporation, that's also kind of a group of human beings, or it can be a group of partnerships or other items. A crowd, a group of people. Evidence would be a group of data or a group of facts. A jury are a group of jurors. A staff or the group of employees. A team is a group of people, maybe players on a team. Maybe it's used metaphorically to not literally be a team, but maybe it's a work group or something like that. But we also see this in the world. We have, in nature, we have a flock of birds or a herd of cows, a gaggle of geese, those types of words to refer to a group of something. So these are all examples of collective nouns. The problem with collective nouns is a little bit the same type of problem we had with indefinite pronouns, in that grammatically collective nouns can be singular, but even when they're singular, they imply plurality. When we say a jury, we all know we're referring to a group, typically of 12, sometimes of 6, sometimes 24 people, human beings. And so the jury is in some sense a unit, but it's also a collection of 12 units. And so in some sense, they are working together as one kind of item, one type of device, so to speak. And in some sense, they're just 12 human beings who have all kinds of different life experiences and different agendas, and they happen to all be in the same room together deciding a case. As a general, so we had the idea of grammatically it's plural, a jury. We don't say we don't say some jury to mean more than one jury, because again, we can see here grammatically it's singular. If we wanted to talk about more than one jury, we would say two juries. If we were talking about more than one staff, we would call it two staffs. And we wouldn't mean by that two members of the staff. We would mean two groups of staff members. Maybe one group of staff members had 7 employees, another group of staff members might have 10. But if we were to say two staffs, we'd be talking about the 7-member group and the 10-member group. We're talking about a total of 17 people, but they're not all part of the same staff. If they were all part of the same staff, we would still say one staff. If we're talking about teams, let's imagine that this is we'll say it's a baseball team with 9 players. We would refer to that single baseball team, we'll call them the Pink Penguins. That would be a team. If the Pink Penguins is playing the Gray Sharks, we would say those are 2 teams, all 18 players together. And so grammatically, we can see that this is a singular word, just like this is a singular word, just like this is a singular word. In fact, all of these words except for evidence can be made plural. It's pretty rare that we hear people say, I have 2 evidences. So I might kind of carve that out and say that it's a little bit like maybe the word fish or sheep. There isn't a plural form that's different than the singular form. But, so we have that tension. Grammatically it's singular, but meaning-wise it's plural. Okay? So English has had kind of 2 different responses to this problem. If we were in England, oftentimes collective nouns receive even when they're in singular format, receive a plural verb. I was listening to something on the BBC the other day, and they said the team have. Let me just write that up there so you can see exactly what I'm saying when I say these words. The team have decided not to make an offer to Mr. X. It was a soccer issue, a football issue. That's what they said, the team have. Now, if American English is your first language, this probably sounds odd to you because almost certainly if you are a Native American English speaker, you would say the team has decided not to make an offer to Mr. X. Because we are focusing in this particular, with collective nouns, we focus more on the grammatical structure. Team is singular, therefore we're going to use a singular verb. We say they have, so do the British, and we say he has or it has. And so this is singular, has is singular, have is plural. But you can see how the British aren't being unreasonable because, of course, the team has many players, many people associated with it. And it doesn't have one collective brain. It's got lots of separate people. And so you can see how there is a logic to using the plural verb because, again, the inherent meaning is a bunch of people, each with their own ideas. But for whatever reason, in American English, we prefer to look at the grammar over the inherent meaning. And so we are going to resolve this tension not the British way, but the American way. Of course, if you move to Britain, obviously you may want to change that practice. I don't know how other countries resolve this issue. For example, I don't know if in Canada they follow the American rule or they follow the British rule. So you may want to consider that as you travel the world. If you also are from a different country where you learned English, I would be interested to hear what the practices are there. So here we have our terms. We've gone through all these are grammatically singular. Let's consider for a second how we would make these plural. We are a member of one committee, now we're a member of 2 committees. We make it plural just as we would any other or most words. It's just we add the S. I was a member of one jury in July, and then I had to be on a second jury. So I've been a member of 2 juries in the last few months, let's say. And so what I did is I got rid of the Y, changed it to an IE, and added an S. Very common way when a word ends in Y in the singular form. The cow was a member of one herd, and then he moved to another herd, and so now he's been a member of 2 herds. Again, we're making it plural just the ordinary way that we make committees plural. That corporation has a subsidiary, and so together they are 2 corporations. I was a member of one team, and then I moved to another team. I've been a member of 2 teams. So the plural format is the same. Now, obviously, when we're talking about 2 teams, we're going to say, whether we're in Britain or the United States, we're going to say the teams have decided not to make an offer. Because now there's no conflict. The word grammatically is plural and the meaning is plural, so of course you're going to use have. That's obvious. And the same would be for all these others. The committees have decided. The herds have grazed on the hay. The corporations have merged. The teams have played. So it's only attention when we have it in singular format from a grammatical perspective, but we have it in but still the inherent meaning is plural. So now I say that the usual answer in English is that we treat it as a singular noun, but there are times where people correctly do treat it as a plural noun. That's a difficult one to consider. The path to decide which one you're going to use is going to depend upon whether, let's see if they have an example of this. It doesn't look like they have an example here, but there are ways grammatically to do that even in American English. My piece of advice, though, would be to have as your default setting that you're going to use that singular verb. And if you feel like you ought to use the plural verb, to go ahead and Google the rule more closely. I'm going to tell you just really briefly what the rule is about, or what that fairly rare exception would be. And that is when you're using a collective term, but you're really focusing on each member of the group. For example, I might talk about a family. Here, let me just write this. Okay. The family has decided to move to Guam. Okay, the family is being treated as a unit. It's a collective noun, meaning lots of people who are related to each other. And so because it's grammatically singular, I have chosen to use has. But let's assume that there's dissension in the family. We want to focus on that dissension. We might say the family have been quarreling about whether the family should move to Guam. So now we're focusing not at the family as a unit, but we're looking at inside that family unit. We're considering each one of the individuals. Mom wants to move to Guam. Son wants to move to Guam. Daughter and father don't want to move to Guam. And so we're focusing on those internal dynamics. And so we're really focusing upon the individual people. And that's why I've chosen to say have here instead of has. But it's still going to sound odd to our ears. So I would say to you, unless you're really a grammar nerd, probably ought to stick to the singular in the vast, vast majority of cases. That should be your default setting, even if you are a grammar nerd. Okay, so that's a description generally about the subject-verb agreement aspects. And that, let me go back to our textbook, that is this section right here. This is the section that's on page 9. Okay, we have the jury has adjourned. The evidence shows. The court has. The board of directors has. This one's a little bit confusing though. Let's pause and look at the board of directors has. You might be tempted to say the board of directors have passed a resolution. If that sounds good to your ear, my guess as to why it sounds good is not because you're thinking that board should be plural or has a plural meaning in this case. It's this word directors, because of obviously the word directors is plural, and because it's right up next to this verb, we are expecting when we have a plural verb, plural noun, and then a verb, that it'll ordinarily be a have instead of a has. Imagine for a second, let me just here we go, make a little change. Here we go. I'm going to annotate for a second. Let me just make this go away, and let's pretend that directors is the beginning of our sentence. We'll add the directors. And then, of course, in this situation, we would absolutely say have. The directors have passed. No matter what brand of English you're speaking, have is going to be the word that you'll want to use here, obviously. But that's not the sentence that we had here. Let me clear this. We have the board, but let's get rid of directors. Obvious, or maybe we say the directors board. Let's do that. this is not easy to write. Here we go. So I'm going to do S apostrophe here. Okay, the director's board has passed a resolution. I don't think any of us would want to say the director's board have, unless of course you're from Great Britain or someplace like that, because board is clearly grammatically singular. So, and this is a common problem which we'll talk about in a different presentation about how words that come between our simple subject, board, and our verb can sometimes throw us, especially in speech, but sometimes also in writing, to use the wrong verb because our ear thinks this is the subject, even though it's not, when this is really the subject. This is one that sometimes people don't get right. Starbucks, many retailers have an S to the end of it. It's a pretty common structure. Let me go ahead here and just do some. Here we go. I worked for JCPenney's for many years. And when I say Penney's, I don't mean that there's more than, I'm not referring to all the stores. What I really mean is that it used to be that this is how people would say it, JCPenney's department store or JCPenney's store. And so, but this is kind of a long expression. And so people started dropping this. It was implied that that's what you're saying, but this was kind of shorthand. So when we said JCPenney's, of course, when we say JCPenney's department store, what we literally mean is the department store belonging to JCPenney. Okay, that's literally what it means. So that's why we have this apostrophe S. If I were to open a department store, I might say the department store belonging to Groover would be Groover's department store. But if this became a wildly popular chain, I might start just saying it briefer. And then after a while, people kind of forgot that this was shorthand for Groover's department store. And so people started just thinking about it being Groover's, and eventually went all the way to just saying Groover's, just with an S. And you'll see that there are some JCPenney stores that still have this apostrophe up here, and there's some that don't. And that's true for many, many department stores or retail stores of whatever type. And we can see here, the Starbucks doesn't have an apostrophe S, and yet historically, what the Starbucks, and I'm not saying Starbucks is a reasonably new company, so it may never have actually followed the grammatical rules, but it would have been Starbucks coffee shop. And then over time, gosh, that's a mouthful, so they started saying Starbucks like this, and then again, with the passage of time, it became just Starbucks. It didn't mean that we're talking about two of the Starbucks shops. We're talking about the whole company, which is a legal entity, a single entity. We'll assume, I'm not exactly sure how it's organized, but let's assume it's a single entity, a single corporation. So this S isn't here to mean plural, it's here to mean apostrophe S or possession. And so in this situation, we absolutely ought to say is. Starbucks is. And most of us would say Starbucks is. But again, that S can throw our ears a little bit, because usually when a noun ends in S, it usually means plural. And so therefore, we'd usually be thinking about saying are. So those are some things to think about. Now, of course, if we were talking about, you know, I sometimes go to the Starbucks in Plano and sometimes to the Starbucks in Frisco. I go to both Starbucks. The Starbucks make tasty coffee. So I am referring not to the complete corporation, but to these particular outlets, so it's appropriate that it be plural. I suppose I could say Starbucks is, and I might actually say that, but let's say I didn't. And so under these circumstances, because I mean the two Starbucks, I would say make, which is the plural, they make, as opposed to makes. But if I wanted to talk about just the chain overall, I really like the Starbucks chain of coffee shops. Oh, sorry. Starbucks makes a good cup of coffee. You can see here I'm referring not just to a particular outlet of Starbucks, but the overall organization. So this has a singular grammatical meaning because it really in theory should be apostrophe S. And so therefore I'm going to say makes. He makes, it makes, not they make. Now, whether you use the apostrophe S or just use the S, you should refer to the preferences of that company. This is especially important if you're representing that particular company, if that company is a client. And so you would probably go to their website to see how they prefer to punctuate their names. So I think that we are in, here's one to talk about if we haven't already. When we talk about time, you treat it as singular. This is idiomatic, so I'm not here to defend it on a logical basis, but 3 hours is a long time. Well, I mean, this is clearly a plural word, and it has a word in front of it that requires plurality. So you might say, well, this is a plural subject, so why are we using a singular verb? We say he is, we don't say they is. The reason, the logic, to the extent there is a logic, is that we're not talking about each hour separately, but we're talking about that expanse of time. So it's one unit of time, and we just so happen to describe that a period of time. We break it down into these 60-minute pieces, but it was a continuous unit. So in a certain way, it's a little bit like a collective noun, like a jury made up of 12 people. Of course, the difference is that it's actually grammatically plural, and yet we still use the singular form. I don't know what they do in Britain in that case, but that's an idiomatic thing. If you are a Native American English speaker, you probably do it without even thinking about it. We also do that with money too. Again, this is a total sum. So you might even think about this. Let me just, here he is. Right, here we go. Okay. $100,000 is a settlement offer. Again, we clearly have a plural word here, dollars, and we have a number in front that tells us that this is more than $1, and yet we still say is. The reason for this is that this is almost implied. The amount of $100,000 is a settlement offer, because this is one unit. We're not going to pay out each dollar separately. Okay, here's the first dollar. Here's the second dollar. No, we're paying it in one lump amount. And so we can look upon it as just a one amount. Obviously, if this were the subject, then we would certainly use is. Of course, this really isn't part of the sentence. I'm pretending that it's part of the sentence, but that's kind of the logic behind it. At the end of the day, it's idiomatic. It's just a quirk of English, of American English, and so you need to follow the rule, but you don't really have to be able to make an argument that it's the right rule. Just do it. Another one is geographic names that end with S. This isn't true everywhere that people say in the United States. I'm not sure that the British would agree with this, but I've heard it said other places. But for us, for those of us in the United States, we don't think about each state as separate. I mean, this is a collective noun. We think about the whole government, the federal government, as representing all 50 states. So we say the United States has pledged foreign aid. I think that when the country was first founded, I think I have heard this, that it was originally the United States have pledged, is what would be said. Because again, the focus was on what each one of those states, there wouldn't have been 50 back then, but maybe 13 or 14 or 15, what each one of those states' position is. Again, it would be focusing upon the components and not the total group. And so, but for us, we would use the singular. Otherwise, it sounds strange, even though there is technically, it is a plural word. Okay, so we are done with the subject-verb agreement section. And really, the other section that we're going to talk about is addressing exactly the same issue, but from a bit of a different perspective. So we're going to go here to, if you have the edition 4, we're on page 20 now. We've already defined what a collective noun is. We've already talked about the issue of the verb. Let me go ahead and get a ability to annotate here. Okay, so before we were debating about whether we say is here or are, and we've decided that we need to say is. That's what we've established at this point. But now we're going to look at the pronoun that we're going to use to describe. Now, once we've decided we're going to use is, we basically decided that this is a singular noun, right? That's what we've done. So obviously, because our the definite third person pronoun that we use has to match the antecedent noun in terms of number, this tells me I don't have a choice. I have to use he, she, it, or some version of that. I can't use them, they, their. That's not going to work. So what we did before logically leads to what we need to do now. They're just two different sides of that same coin. Let me go to our cheat sheet so we can just look at this for a second. Okay, as a general rule, third person pronouns require an antecedent noun. The pronoun must match its antecedent in number, person, and gender. So if the antecedent noun is singular, and that's basically what we've decided here, that the corporation is singular because we're using is, then we have to use its. Now, this first problem of using is or are, most of us aren't going to have any issue with. So what I covered just for the last several minutes, you know, is nice to talk about it, but you were probably sitting there going, yeah, whatever. Yeah, I'm not going to make that mistake. That sounds weird. But this mistake, if you're like me, you're going to make all the time. So even though we've decided is correct, we're still going to use there. Let me just read to you the two sentences, and you can see how many people would make this mistake. The corporation is holding their annual meeting next week. That doesn't sound that terrible to my ears. Let's hear it the other way. The corporation is holding its annual meeting next week. Okay, I mean, that sounds better. But still, I can imagine a smart, well-educated person saying there here. For whatever reason, we aren't as sensitive to this issue. We know to use is, but we don't then also remember that we need to use a singular pronoun to replace it. So this is a good way to check. If you use a there in this place, or them or they, depending upon the sentence, but the antecedent noun takes a singular verb, you know you've got to disconnect, you've got to fix it. And of course, we have 3 strategies for fixing it, so it doesn't necessarily mean you have to change its. Depending on the circumstances, you might want to do something different. Now, why do we want to use there? What is the temptation that we're contending with? Well, it's the same temptation we were talking about before. When we think about a corporation, sometimes we think about it as a legal abstraction, a filing that we do with the government. But you know what? As a practical matter, it's human beings. I mean, a corporation doesn't do anything. It's just a legal fiction. It's a piece of paper. It's the people in the corporation that makes decisions. I mean, the person uh, whoever is holding the annual meeting, that's a human being up there on the podium. It's not a corporation talking, because a corporation can't talk. It's people, more than one people probably. And when we're thinking about more than one people, we're very prone to say there. Let's imagine another statement, or let's look at another example. Let's go to the words that we had before. The committee has met. They decided not to have another meeting this month. Okay, well, committee is singular in this situation, so I was right to use has, because we say he has, we say they have. So we're right here. Now we have they. Well, who's this they? We must be talking about members of the committee, but we don't have an antecedent. Now we could change it up if we wanted to make this work, so we could either change this to it, because obviously a committee, even though it's made up of human beings, it as a separate unit from the individuals is an it. It decided not to have another meeting this month. So that's one solution. That's changing the pronoun. That's one of the strategies. Or we could say the committee members. Now we're going to say have, because now we have a plural antecedent. Have met, or a plural subject. They decided, because again, our antecedent is members, not to have another meeting this month. So what happens when we switch to a they format is we are kind of making our own antecedent noun. It's close. It's in the neighborhood of a true antecedent, but it's not quite that true antecedent. And you can see how we fall into that error, because you know what? I mean, a committee doesn't decide anything. It's the people on the committee who vote, right? And there probably were some committee members who thought, yeah, we ought to have another meeting this month. We've got some more issues to address. I mean, maybe there were. We don't know. Just because the committee decided not to doesn't mean there weren't some holdouts, right? And so when we start thinking from a human perspective of what would that decision look like? Well, it would be a bunch of people talking. Oh, I think we ought to have another meeting. Well, we don't have time. You know, all that kind of discussion would happen. And so then we're likely to say they, because we envision these people sitting around a table going back and forth about whether they ought to have a meeting or not. That's kind of how it happens. It's very reasonable that it happens. And when you make this error in spoken English, it doesn't bother me even a little bit. It's a very human thing. I'm sure that there are some grammar nerds out there that don't make that error when they speak, but I'm not one of them. I do make this error all the time when I speak. It's okay to make the error in spoken English. The challenge is not making this error when we write. And the first draft of what you write, it's even okay to have that error there. But once you're getting closer to the finish line, once you're, several drafts down the road, that's when you're going to want to go through and have one check where you're making sure, hey, I'm using they as my antecedent noun singular. If it's a collective noun and it's grammatically singular, I need to use it instead of they. So let me make sure there's nothing else we have to cover. I guess we are in good shape going forward. So at this point, I think that we're ready to conclude this session. And thank you for your attention, and have a wonderful